Hi everyone, this is Sam from Birmingham and we're here with Sublevel Redux. Can you tell us a bit, for those who don't know, what Sublevel Redux is? Sublevel Zero Redux.
So it's a roguelike 6 degree of freedom shooter. So if anyone's played Descent or Forsaken, it's that kind of game. So you're in a zero-G environment in a gunship and you can move up and down, side to side, roll, pitch, like any movement you want to do, you can do it. So the roguelike aspect of it obviously means it's procedurally generated, so we give you a different level every time. There's a campaign, so there's a set sort of structure to the game, but every level you get is always different every time. So the next time you play it, next time you die, which you'll do a lot, it'll be completely different. So all the drops are randomly generated, all the enemies. So when you get new weapons, for instance, there are set sort of types of weapons, but the stats on them change. So you might get an autocannon with a higher fire rate and a lower accuracy, or vice versa, or whatever. There's also a crafting system, so depending on which blueprints you've unlocked, which is something you do, so when you finish a run or die, you will unlock new content. You can craft two weapons into a new weapon, so you kind of have a tiered system, and by the time you get to the top, there's just crazy stuff happening everywhere. So we've got like a Sith lightning flamethrower gun, and you know, we've got all kinds of like homing swarm missiles and cluster missiles and all kinds of cool stuff. So by the time you get to the end, you kind of have this really highly powered, really fun ship build, which only accentuates the tension when you're that close to death.
How did you feel developing 6 Degrees of Freedom? Was it difficult to get that much freedom of movement in the game?
So it's the important thing for us is really getting the feeling of the movement right, and that's absolutely key. So we want to make sure that it feels like you're piloting a vehicle and you're not just a camera, you know. So it's not a mouse look shooter. It is very much you're in kind of a spaceship, but you're inside. So making that work with the procedural generation as well, that was kind of the tricky bit. So as far as we're aware, nobody else has done procedural generation that's actually truly fully 3D like that. You know, everything is essentially usually constrained to one plane. So even if you're sort of, let's say you're making an FPS and it's procedurally generated, okay, so you're taking those rooms but you're putting them on a 2D set of tiles. Whereas for us, our rooms can come off at all different directions and they can loop back around and all sorts of things. So getting that working well with the movement mechanics is tricky, and especially because we have, so one of the most useful things about Descent that didn't actually work as well as it should have is the map view. So you're in these completely 3D environments, you can get lost really easy, it's a massive 3D maze. So the fact they had a map view was of course essential. Unfortunately, when you get beyond the first levels, the maps are so complicated that with the sort of wireframe rendering that they use for the maps, and they couldn't really do anything more because of computing power, of course, it gets really complicated. And you can't tell if this line is part of this room or this room, and you have no depth perception. So we spent a lot of time kind of getting that right with ours and having and we've gone for kind of a Metroid Prime inspired kind of look. So it uncovers as you go and it's really useful, but you can still tell where you are and you've got the depth perception and various sort of cues of, okay, there's a door here, there's a key here, and things like that that really help you out with that 3D navigation.
Dwelling a bit more on the look, what would you say is the inspiration behind the visual style? Because it's very colourful, but it's also reminiscent of other things.
So yeah, and this is kind of, it's the whole thing is designed to complement the gameplay in the sense that the gameplay is very retro with modern elements, and the look is very much again retro with modern elements. So we've got a low poly, you know, pixelated kind of look, but with, you know, lots of neon, lots of bloom, lots of sort of modern shaders that give it that kind of sheen and tie it all together. And likewise, the soundtrack is very much kind of, it has sort of modern elements, but it's also driven by this kind of chiptunes kind of sound, and it's all blended together in a way that it all works. So it's kind of really, again, sort of driving home this idea that we've got these retro elements blended with modern elements to make something that's kind of new and you haven't seen before.
What's in store for the future for Sublevel Zero Redux?
So this being Redux, this is, you know, this is the console version. The game is already out, the non-Redux version is already out on Steam. and we're still updating that regularly, including VR support that we're working on at the moment, and there is a public beta for that on Steam. So this is us developing the console version, and there's a lot of updates going into this, a lot more content. We're tweaking the campaign structure, adding new enemies, adding new unlocks, a lot of cool stuff. And the plan is once we've finished working on that for the console version and release the console version, we'll be working to bring that back to the PC version. So PC players will get all of that content, and people who already have the game will have that for free.
Is motion sickness something you considered with such a fast-moving game like this? In VR, I mean.
Well, I mean, to be fair, there are some people who get motion sick not in VR. With a game like this, it's always going to be kind of an intense experience, and certainly back when Descent itself was released, there were lots of people who had motion sickness with it because it was something nobody had tried before. Of course, now we're much more used to kind of first-person shooters and that kind of style of movement, so it's a lot better, but you still get the odd person who kind of feels motion sick. As far as VR is concerned, again, it's always going to be an intense game, but we've done a lot of work to like maximize that comfort. So we've done a lot of stuff like the motion of the ship is actually different in VR to how it is in non-VR, and it feels the same because in VR everything kind of feels faster. So we've actually slowed it down to keep the feeling the same and also to minimize that motion sickness. And we do things like we snap you to the axis, so you don't sort of float around so freely. So we kind of control that a bit more and make sure that you're usually looking at something that's kind of right angles rather than kind of floating around. And then we've also got other techniques. So we use something called tunneling, which is where, and you can turn it on or off, where if the ship's rotating quickly, we actually sort of vignette the screen to cut off the peripheral vision. And even for people who get motion sickness, in a lot of cases that just cuts it out completely. It's a really effective solution. And a lot of the time you don't really notice it's happening as well because it's just in your periphery, but it turns out that's where most of your, as far as your ocular system is concerned, most of your motion sensing goes on in the periphery. So if you're not seeing in the periphery anymore, a lot of that perceived motion goes away and motion sickness just kind of drops off for most people. So we've got a lot of really effective systems in there. And it's always going to be an intense game. Again, I've got to stress that. It is an intense game. It's designed to be an intense game. But with all the things we put in for the VR version, I think most people will find it comfortable.
And when can fans expect Sublevel Zero Redux, and on what consoles, on what platforms?
So we're releasing it on Xbox One and PS4. As I say, we'll be rolling a lot of this stuff back into the PC version as well. In terms of release date, we're not sure exactly yet. It won't be long. We're looking at the next couple of months kind of thing. We don't want to say anything concrete because we haven't decided that, but it won't be long.
Thank you very much for your time.